What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved gentlemen faces off against a talk show host who pushes too far? In just 27 seconds, Jonathan Ross would discover that even James Bond has his breaking point, and the aftermath would leave the entire studio in stunned silence. This is the exclusive story of what really went down last night when Pierce Brosnan walked into what should have been a routine chat show appearance, only to find himself under attack from a host who seemed determined to humiliate him on live television. What you're about to hear is the shocking truth about how one of cinema's most respected actors was pushed to his absolute limit, and how his explosive response left everyone questioning who the real villain was. The Friday night show was supposed to be a celebration. Pierce Brosnan, looking as sharp as ever in his perfectly tailored Navy suit, had agreed to appear as the main guest to promote his latest film. The audience was buzzing with excitement, cameras were rolling, and everything seemed set for another entertaining evening of witty banter and Hollywood charm. But from the moment Pierce stepped onto that familiar set, something felt different. Jonathan Ross, usually known for his cheeky humor and playful interviews, had a strange glint in his eye. There was an edge to his smile that suggested this would be no ordinary conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Pierce Brosnan," Jonathan announced with theatrical flair, his voice booming across the packed studio. The audience erupted into applause as Pierce made his entrance, waving graciously and flashing that famous smile that had won hearts around the world. Pierce settled into the guest chair, crossing one leg over the other with the effortless elegance that had made him a screen icon. He looked relaxed, confident, ready for whatever questions might come his way. After all, he had done this countless times before. How difficult could it be? Pierce, Jonathan began, leaning forward in his chair with that trademark mischievous grin. "You look fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Tell me, how does it feel to be getting on a bit but still trying to play the action hero?" The question landed like a slap. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing immediately that this was not the usual friendly opening they had come to expect. Pierce's smile faltered for just a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed what had just been said. "I'm sorry, Jonathan, but I'm not quite sure what you mean by that," Pierce replied, his voice steady but with a hint of steel beneath the surface. "I feel as strong and capable as ever, and I think my recent work speaks for itself." Jonathan chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, come now, Pierce. You're what, 71 now? Surely you must realize that all this running around, jumping off buildings, fighting the bad guys, it's a young man's game. Don't you think it's time to step aside and let the younger generation take over?" The studio fell silent except for the quiet hum of the cameras. Even the usually animated studio audience seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something was going terribly wrong. Pierce's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair just a little too firmly. "Age is just a number, Jonathan," Pierce said carefully, his Irish accent becoming more pronounced as his composure began to crack. "Experience, dedication, and professionalism matter far more than how many candles are on your birthday cake. I've been fortunate to have a long and varied career, and I'm proud of every role I've taken on." But Jonathan was not finished. He leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "But surely you must see how ridiculous it looks when someone your age is trying to romance actresses who could be your granddaughter?" The audience must be sitting there thinking, "Come on, this is just embarrassing." The words hung in the air like poison. Several audience members gasped audibly, and even the camera operators seemed to shift nervously behind their equipment. This had crossed a line, and everyone in the studio knew it. Pierce's face had gone very still, his blue eyes now blazing with barely controlled anger. When he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "I think you need to be very careful about the assumptions you're making, Jonathan. My personal life and my professional choices are not up for your crude commentary." "Oh, touched a nerve, have we?" Jonathan laughed, clearly delighted by Pierce's reaction. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking. Maybe it's time for old James Bond to hang up his tuxedo and admit that his best days are behind him." That was the moment everything changed. Pierce Brosnan, the man who had always been the epitome of grace under pressure, the actor who had handled decades of interviews with charm and wit, finally reached his breaking point. "Now listen here, you arrogant little man," Pierce began, his voice rising as he leaned forward in his chair. "I've been nothing but professional and courteous since I walked onto this stage, and you have repaid that courtesy with disrespect and cheap insults." The studio erupted in shocked murmurs as Pierce continued, his famous composure completely shattered. "You seem to think that hiding behind your desk and your cameras gives you the right to attack people who are simply trying to do their job and entertain your audience. Jonathan's smirk was beginning to fade as he realized that his guest was no longer playing along with what he had assumed was harmless ribbing. "Pierce, I think you're overreacting a bit. It's just a bit of fun. You know how these things work." "Fun?" Pierce's voice cracked like a whip across the studio. "You call attacking someone's age, their career, their personal relationships fun? This isn't comedy, Jonathan. This is bullying, plain and simple." The audience was completely silent now, transfixed by the unprecedented drama unfolding before their eyes. Pierce Brosnan, beloved by millions, was defending himself with a passion and intensity that none of them had ever seen before. "I have spent my entire career treating people with respect and dignity," Pierce continued, his voice now carrying to every corner of the studio. "I have worked with actors and actresses of all ages, and I have never, not once, made anyone feel uncomfortable or unwelcome on a set." Jonathan was beginning to look genuinely uncomfortable now, realizing that his attempts at edgy humor had backfired spectacularly. "Look, Pierce, if I've offended you, that wasn't my intention." "Your intention?" Pierce stood up suddenly, his tall frame towering over the seated host. "Your intention was to humiliate me in front of your audience for the sake of a few cheap laughs. Well, congratulations, Jonathan. You've succeeded in showing everyone exactly what kind of person you really are." The confrontation was reaching a fever pitch, and everyone in the studio could sense that something explosive was about to happen. The atmosphere in the studio was electric with tension as Pierce Brosnan stood towering over Jonathan Ross, his hands clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled fury. The audience sat frozen in their seats, witnessing something they had never seen before on live television. Jonathan, perhaps sensing that he had pushed too far, tried to regain control of the situation with a nervous laugh. "Pierce, please, sit down. Let's just take a deep breath and get back to the interview, shall we?" But Pierce remained standing, his piercing blue eyes locked onto the host's face. "No, Jonathan, I will not sit down. I will not pretend that what just happened here is acceptable behavior from someone in your position." The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of this unprecedented confrontation. Behind the scenes, producers were frantically whispering into their headsets, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the drama continue to unfold. "You invited me here tonight," Pierce continued, his voice carrying the full weight of his decades in the entertainment industry. "You asked me to come onto your show as your guest, and I accepted that invitation in good faith. I came here prepared to talk about my work, to share some stories with your audience, to be entertaining and engaging." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usual confidence now completely evaporated. "And we appreciate that, Pierce. We really do." "Do you?" Pierce's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you brought me here for one reason only, to mock me and tear me down for the amusement of your viewers." The studio was so quiet that the whir of the air conditioning system seemed deafeningly loud. Every person in that room, from the cameramen to the audience members to the production assistants, was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "That's not true," Jonathan protested weakly, but his words lacked conviction. "I was just trying to have a bit of fun, keep things lively." Pierce shook his head slowly, his expression one of profound disappointment. "Fun? Let me tell you what's fun, Jonathan. Fun is when two people engage in playful banter where both parties are enjoying themselves. Fun is when jokes are shared, not when one person becomes the target of another person's cruelty." He began to pace slowly behind his chair, like a caged lion finally ready to strike back. "What you did tonight was not fun. It was mean-spirited, it was unprofessional, and it was completely unnecessary." Jonathan made another attempt to salvage the situation. "Look, Pierce, I think we're both getting a bit worked up here. Why don't we just reset, start fresh, and talk about your new film?" But Pierce stopped pacing and turned to face him directly. "Reset? Start fresh? As if nothing happened? As if you didn't just spend the last 15 minutes trying to humiliate one of your guests on live television?" The host's face was now visibly flushed, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the studio's air conditioning. "I really think you're blowing this out of proportion." "Am I?" Pierce's voice rose again, echoing throughout the studio. "Let me ask you something, Jonathan. How would you feel if you went to someone's home as their invited guest, and they spent the entire evening insulting your age, your appearance, your career, and your personal relationships?" Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but Pierce cut him off before he could speak. "You would feel exactly the same way I'm feeling right now, angry, hurt, and betrayed by someone who should have treated you with basic human decency." The audience was completely captivated by Pierce's passionate defense of himself. Here was a man who had always been known for his gentlemanly behavior, his professionalism, and his grace under pressure. finally showing the world that even he had limits. You seem to think, Pierce continued, his accent growing thicker with emotion, that because I'm an actor, because I'm in the public eye, that somehow gives you the right to treat me as less than human, as if I don't have feelings, as if I don't deserve the same respect you would show to any other person. Jonathan was squirming in his seat now, clearly regretting his decision to take such an aggressive approach with his guest. Pierce, I never meant to suggest that you're less than human. That's ridiculous. Is it? Pierce challenged. Because that's exactly how you've been treating me since the moment I sat down in that chair. Like I'm some kind of circus animal here for your entertainment, to be poked and prodded until I perform for your audience. The confrontation was intensifying with every word, and everyone in the studio could sense that they were witnessing something historic. This was not just a disagreement between a host and his guest. This was a moment of raw, unfiltered truth that was being broadcast to millions of viewers. I have been in this business for over 40 years, Pierce declared, his voice strong and unwavering. I have worked with some of the most talented and respected people in the entertainment industry. Directors, producers, fellow actors. They have all treated me with professionalism and respect, because that is how civilized people behave toward one another. He gestured toward Jonathan with obvious disdain. But you, sitting there behind your desk with your smug little smile, you think you can say whatever you want, hurt whoever you want, because you have a television show and a live audience. Jonathan made one more desperate attempt to defend himself. I'm a comedian, Pierce. Comedy sometimes means pushing boundaries, making people a little uncomfortable. That's what I do. Pierce's response was immediate and devastating. No, Jonathan, what you do is hide behind the word comedy to justify being cruel to people who can't fight back. Real comedians, truly funny people, they don't need to tear others down to get laughs. They lift people up. They bring joy. They make the world a little brighter. The studio erupted in spontaneous applause from several audience members who couldn't contain their admiration for Pierce's passionate speech. Jonathan looked around nervously, realizing that public opinion was rapidly turning against him. You call yourself a comedian? Pierce pressed on. But there was nothing funny about what you said to me tonight. There was nothing clever, nothing witty, nothing that would make any decent person laugh. It was just mean. Jonathan's voice was now barely above a whisper. I'm sorry if you feel that way. If I feel that way? Pierce's eyes flashed with renewed anger. This isn't about my feelings, Jonathan. This is about right and wrong. This is about how we treat each other as human beings. The confrontation had reached a critical point, and everyone in the studio knew that something monumental was about to happen. Pierce Brosnan, pushed beyond his limit by a host who had mistaken cruelty for comedy, was about to deliver the knockout punch that would end this disastrous interview once and for all. 27 seconds. That's all the time it would take for Pierce Brosnan to deliver the words that would leave Jonathan Ross speechless and the entire studio in stunned silence. The moment of truth had arrived. Pierce Brosnan stood in the center of that studio like a man who had finally found his voice after years of polite silence. The cameras captured every detail of his face as he prepared to deliver what would become the most talked-about television moment of the year. Jonathan Ross sat frozen in his chair, his usual cockiness completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning realization that he had picked a fight with the wrong person. The studio audience was so silent you could hear a pin drop, every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. Pierce took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of 4 decades in show business and a lifetime of treating people with dignity and respect. You know what the real tragedy is here, Jonathan? Pierce began, his voice calm but filled with unmistakable authority. The real tragedy is that you had an opportunity tonight to have a genuine conversation with someone who has lived an extraordinary life, who has stories to tell and experiences to share that could have entertained and inspired your audience. He gestured toward the stunned crowd. These people came here tonight expecting to be uplifted, to laugh, to feel good about themselves and the world around them. Instead, you chose to use your platform to spread negativity and cruelty. Jonathan tried once more to interrupt. Pierce, I really think we should just move on and talk about your film. But Pierce held up his hand, silencing him with nothing more than a look. No, Jonathan, you started this conversation, and I'm going to finish it. The authority in Pierce's voice was absolute. This was a man who had commanded respect on movie sets around the world, who had worked with the biggest names in Hollywood, who had earned his place among the industry's most respected figures through sheer professionalism and talent. Do you know what I see when I look at you right now? Pierce asked, his piercing gaze never leaving Jonathan's face. I see a small, insecure man who thinks that tearing others down will somehow make him seem bigger and more important. The words hit Jonathan like physical blows. His face had gone pale, and he seemed to shrink deeper into his chair with each sentence. Pierce continued, his voice growing stronger and more passionate. I see someone who has confused meanness with wit, cruelty with comedy, and bullying with entertainment. And the saddest part is, you probably don't even realize how empty and pathetic that makes you look to everyone watching. Several audience members began to nod in agreement, their sympathy now completely with Pierce. They had come to see their beloved former James Bond, and instead they had witnessed him being attacked by someone who was supposed to be professional and welcoming. Let me tell you something about respect, Jonathan, Pierce said, beginning to pace again, his movements controlled but filled with barely contained energy. Respect is not something you demand, it's something you earn. And you earn it by treating others the way you want to be treated yourself. Jonathan's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. He had completely lost control of his own show, and everyone in the studio knew it. Pierce stopped pacing and turned to face the audience directly. I want to apologize to all of you, he said, his voice softening slightly. You came here tonight expecting entertainment, and instead you've had to witness this unfortunate display of unprofessional behavior. The audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation that lasted nearly a full minute. They were showing their support for Pierce and their disapproval of how he had been treated. When the applause finally died down, Pierce turned back to Jonathan, who was now visibly sweating despite the cool studio temperature. And as for you, Pierce said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the studio, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember what it feels like to be on the receiving end of public humiliation. The studio was so quiet that the sound of the cameras seemed loud as thunder. This was it, the 27 seconds that would define this entire confrontation. Pierce looked directly into the main camera, addressing not just the studio audience, but the millions of viewers watching at home. To everyone out there watching this, I want you to know that age is not something to be ashamed of. Experience is not something to mock. And dignity is not something that anyone has the right to take away from you. He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the knockout punch. I came here tonight as Jonathan's guest, prepared to be gracious and entertaining. Instead, I've been forced to defend my basic human dignity against someone who clearly doesn't understand the difference between comedy and cruelty. Jonathan made one final, desperate attempt to save face. Pierce, I think maybe we can find a way to end this on a more positive note. Pierce's response was swift and devastating. The only positive thing about this entire experience, Jonathan, is that it's shown your audience exactly who you really are, and I think they've seen quite enough. With that, Pierce Brosnan straightened his jacket, looked once more at the stunned host, and began walking toward the edge of the stage. The studio erupted in chaos as audience members began talking excitedly among themselves. Cameramen scrambled to follow Pierce's movement, and production assistants spoke frantically into their headsets. Jonathan called out desperately, Pierce, please don't go, we can work this out. But Pierce didn't even turn around. He raised one hand in a dismissive wave and kept walking, his dignity intact, his head held high, leaving behind a host who had just learned the hardest lesson of his career. As Pierce disappeared into the wings, the studio fell into stunned silence. Jonathan sat alone at his desk, looking like a man who had just watched his reputation crumble before his eyes. The audience didn't know whether to applaud, boo, or simply sit in shocked amazement at what they had witnessed. In those final 27 seconds, Pierce Brosnan had delivered a masterclass in standing up for yourself with grace, dignity, and devastating effectiveness. He had shown the world that even the most patient, professional, and gentlemanly person has a breaking point, and when that point is reached, the results can be absolutely explosive. Jonathan Ross was left sitting alone on his own stage, faced with an audience that had just watched him be completely dismantled by one of the most respected figures in entertainment. The silence stretched on, broken only by the mechanical whir of the cameras that had captured every moment of his downfall. This was the moment that would be replayed countless times, analyzed and discussed by media experts and ordinary viewers alike. The moment when Pierce Brosnan, beloved by millions around the world, finally said enough is enough and walked away from a confrontation that never should have happened in the first place. The interview was over, but the impact of those explosive 27 seconds would be felt for years to come.